of that. So now we'll continue on and go into lesson 2 on the branches of government. Separation of powers. The Federalist Papers laid out the structure and purpose of the government. And they said that no one person or group, whether politicians or factions, would be able to gain too much control because of the way the Constitution set up the government through its separation of powers. There was no way that any one person or group could take too much power. And of course, factions is a big issue in Federalist 10. Now, Article 1, the legislative branch. Article 1, again, deals with the legislative branch right off the bat, first thing in the Constitution after the preamble, because the Federalists and James Madison and others who were involved in the Constitutional Convention thought that Congress was the most powerful. So they started with it. Article 1 sets out the bicameral legislature. Bi meaning two, cameral like chamber. So the legislature has two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, it can be a little confusing because we say two houses of Congress when only one's called the House. That's because they're sort of based on like the parliamentary system in England where you had the House of Lords and the House of Commons. We just called one the House of Representatives and the other one is called the Senate. But that's bicameral legislature set up in Article 1. Okay, so within the House of Representatives, they are elected directly by the people. Populations of the state, populations of a local district would vote and represent or vote for their representative. This again was representative of the population. The House of Representatives is based on population. In order to be a representative, you have to be at least 25 years old, and they're elected for 2 years at a time. The reason for 2 years, which is a fairly short amount of time to be elected, is that they have to keep in close contact with their constituents, the people they represent. That way, if there's a new issue, a pressing issue, something people are concerned about today, the representatives have to worry about that because they're up for election within the next 2 years. That's different than the Senate, which is elected for 6 years. This was to give senators a longer term so they could think more long term. So a lot of what the Constitution was set up to do is balance various issues. One is balance short-term thinking with long-term thinking. So short-term in the House, longer-term in the Senate. Originally, the Senate was elected by state legislatures, not by the population. So this was to balance the federalism issue, where the people would be represented by the House of Representatives, but the states would still be represented by the Senate. One thing to remember, we've been over before, is that when the Constitution and before that the Articles of Confederation were written after the American Revolution, the states were effectively their own countries, and they were trying to unite them. So it's not the United People of America, it's the United States of America. So if you wanted these states to join this new union, you had to guarantee that they wouldn't just be run over. So the Senate was one way to do that. Senators would be elected by state legislators. This also was to allow the Senate to be representative of sort of the best of Americans. Presumably, the state legislatures would elect, well-educated, well-informed citizens, whereas the House of Representatives was just common people. So in that way, it's sort of like the House of Lords and the House of Commons in Parliament. But this all changed with the 17th Amendment. Now we elect senators directly, and this has had some pretty big impacts on the government over time. But originally, legislatures elected senators. They're elected for 6 years, and they also have to be 30 years old. A little bit older. Again, they're supposed to be a little bit more mature, a little bit wiser.
Is it still 6 years?
Yes.
It still is?
Still 6 years for senators, yes.
Okay.
Okay, in the legislative branch, in the Article 1 of the Constitution, there's something called the enumerated powers. These are things that are directly given in the Constitution to the Congress. This is such as the ability to declare war, also the ability to regulate interstate commerce. Those are stated in the Constitution as Congress's powers. There's also something called the Necessary and Proper Clause. This says that the Congress can do anything necessary and proper to fulfill one of the enumerated powers. Sometimes this is also called the elastic clause because it stretches based on interpretation there. So some of the examples are the ability to draft people in the military. When the military first created the draft, courts had to decide, are people required to sign up for the draft, and do they have to serve if drafted? And this was considered necessary and proper for the enumerated power of declaring war. If Congress can declare war and send an army, they must have the ability to form an army, and that might require drafting people. Also, creating a national bank, going to the enumerated power of regulating interstate commerce, printing money, things like that. The enumerated power of managing national economies goes to the necessary and proper part of creating a national bank. So these are not specifically stated in the Constitution, but have been interpreted as necessary and proper for the enumerated powers. Then we get into the executive branch. Remember, the Articles of Confederation did not have an executive at all. It only had a legislature, which was really weak, but it did not have a president and it did not have courts. This goes back to the idea that the colonies were really leery of having a king. They didn't want a king. They didn't want anyone who could become a king. So the idea of one person in charge, a president, they didn't want that. So the Articles of Confederation didn't have that. But the Articles of Confederation were really weak and fell apart after Shays' Rebellion. So now, as we get into the Constitution, people are recognizing we need a little bit bigger of a government. So now we have an executive branch. This is in Article 2 of the Constitution. And the president is over the federal bureaucracy. Bureaucracy. Crassy means government of or ruling of. A bureau, which is like an agency. So the bureaucracy is all these agencies that the government has, such as the Environmental Protection Agency, Internal Revenue Service, Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, DOE, Department of Energy, Health and Human Services. All these government agencies that run the day-to-day activities. The people who work in the bureaucracy mostly are career employees, which means that presidents come and go, but these people are there for their whole career. They're supposed to be experts in whatever issue they're dealing with, and they do what the Congress and president say, but they're career employees. The president oversees them. The president appoints the head of each agency, but again, most of the employees are career employees. The president is also the commander-in-chief of the military. He is in charge of the military. This was intentional to put a civilian in charge of the military. That way we wouldn't have to worry about like a military coup, the military taking over the government. So the military is under the command of the president, a civilian. The president is also given the power to make treaties and appoint federal judges and ambassadors. However, that is balanced or checked by the Senate, who advise and consent on those things. So when the president nominates someone for being an ambassador or a judge, the Senate has to approve that. Same thing with treaties. The president can write a treaty, but the Senate has to confirm or reject that. So that leads to the judicial branch, Article 3. Again, originally this was thought to be the weakest branch, but today the Supreme Court has become really important, and there's huge arguments every time someone's nominated to the Supreme Court, arguments about whether they should or should not be, because the Supreme Court has become so important politically. But originally it was considered to be really weak. When judges are appointed to federal courts, whether it's the Supreme Court or a district court, judges are appointed for life. They have that job as long as they want it for the rest of their life, assuming they keep good behavior, which is not really defined in the Constitution. That's kind of up to the House of Representatives and the Senate, because they can impeach a judge. So judges don't just get fired. They don't have term limits like other representatives. They have their job for life, but they can be impeached if the House of Representatives and the Senate believe that they've done something so wrong that they should be removed from office. The judicial branch has judicial review. That's the ability to interpret the Constitution and say laws or policies are unconstitutional. The first time this happened was a Supreme Court case, Marbury v. Madison in 1803. Again, this is something we'll talk more about when we get to Supreme Court cases later on, but this is the first time the Supreme Court ruled a law unconstitutional and invalidated it. There's an old joke in politics and legal studies that the Constitution means whatever the Supreme Court says it means. So people will argue about what the Supreme Court should do or what the Constitution really means, but legally speaking, it means whatever the Constitution or whatever the Supreme Court says it means. Then we get into checks and balances built into the Constitution. Each branch has the ability to balance or check the other branches. So for example, the president can veto bills from Congress. Congress sends the president a bill to be approved or not. He can veto it. Of course, Congress can also override that later on with a much stronger vote. The president can nominate judges. Congress can impeach the president or impeach judges. The Congress controls the budget for the president and also controls the size and budget of the courts. The courts can rule laws or the enforcement from the president of laws as unconstitutional or just wrong. So unconstitutional, they can say this law or this policy goes against the Constitution. As far as being wrong, if the president enforces a law a certain way, the courts could say, no, that's not what the law means. Here's what it should have been interpreted as. So courts can do that. And then the Chief Justice, one of the Supreme Court justices, presides, not resides, but presides over presidential impeachment to perform a check on the power of Congress to impeach the president. And that is the end. Any questions?